Okay. Any questions about the announcements? All right. Okay, so let's start with the lecture. So last class we did two things. Is there a question anywhere? Yeah. Oh. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Hold on. Thanks. I think I forgot to post the. Okay, so last class we talked about the pumping lemma, which we used to show limitations of regular languages, right? And then we defined this new concept, Turing machines, which were basically a simple twist on top of what DFAs were, right? We said, okay, well, let's allow ourselves memory, which is a long infinite tape where we can read as well as write. And the other thing was we said, okay, the head, instead of just moving right in a DFA, you can move left and right. You can move backwards and forwards. And we also saw one simple example of a Turing machine, which was the machine which just flipped the input. Right? We just computed the negation of the input as its output. So today my goal is to look at two more examples of Turing machines. You should realize that Turing machines are really like a programming language by themselves, a much more basic one than even machine code. And then we'll start comparing it to the kind of stuff that we actually use, the kind of computers, the kind of languages that we see, and evaluate where Turing machines stand and how far they help us in our ultimate goal at the beginning of the lecture, at the beginning of the course, which was how can I build a model of computing? Okay? So just to recall, so a Turing machine for us was essentially described by a transition function, right? So you have a transition function which takes a state, a symbol from the alphabet space, which is no longer 0, 1, and outputs a new state that you would transition to, along with some other things. If it were a DFA, you would just have a new state, but now we have a couple of other things. A symbol that you might use to overwrite your current position, and also tells us where your head should go next. Should it go left? Should it go right? Should it stay where it is? Or should it halt? Okay? And we said, if I have a Turing machine M, the output of M on X is everything on tape till the head position. Okay, so you basically have your long tape, but eventually when the machine finishes its computation, the output is going to be everything on the tape until where the head is. Okay, and just as we talked about languages and computability for finite automaton, we can also talk about similar things for Turing machines. Okay, so we say that a Turing machine M computes a function F from binary alphabet to binary alphabet. Okay, so I tell you a function. Okay, here's my function. I want to check whether my string is a palindrome or not. Now, if X is a palindrome, the function should be 1, the output should be 1. If it's not a palindrome, the output should be 0. And we'll say that a machine M computes the function F if for all inputs M of X equals F of X. Okay? And finally, we also say a Turing machine M recognizes or computes a language. Okay, so remember we had this notion of languages and functions, both of them are equivalent. We say it computes a language L if basically X is in the language implies M outputs 1, and if X is not in the language, then M outputs 0. Okay? Any questions? And here, there's a subtle difference in enforcing that when X is not in the language, you want your machine to actually output 0. It's not just saying, okay, it's not going to output 1. You also say it has to output something, which is 0. And the difference is that the way we define Turing machines, they might not always have an output, right? So remember, Turing machines can sometimes run forever, in which case, so we should add a qualifier here, which is if M halts. Okay, and otherwise output is this null symbol. Okay. Okay, so this is all just some sort of nomenclature. It's not too important. But now let's try and use Turing machines to compute some simple functions. Okay. And the first function that we kind of saw a demo of in last class was palindrome. So let me define. So palindrome. As a language, it is all X such that X equals reverse of X. Okay, so the string reads the same front and backwards. And the question is palindromes computable by a Turing machine? If it is, how can I program a Turing machine to compute that? So what should my machine do if I wanted to recognize those strings which read the same front and back? Any ideas? So let me draw a picture and then I'll let you fill in the blanks. So when writing Turing machines, you can take two approaches. One is the finely detailed one, where you explicitly write down the transition function, right? So I have this delta, which takes a state, a symbol, then I have to tell you what to do on each one. Okay? That is what you really need to do if I was to go and program it, but we won't do that for most of the examples. For most of the examples, a sufficiently detailed and rigorous high-level explanation is enough. Okay? We'll see just the example what I mean. So what is our goal here? So remember, the setup in any Turing machine is you start with the tape being loaded with the input. Okay, and then this is really just infinite. Okay, and the head starts somewhere here. So now tell me, what should the machine do if I have to recognize that the string is a palindrome or not? Any ideas? Say it again. The outside in, so check that first. Okay, so that's what we want to do. So let me put that as a main idea, right? Kind of the highest level idea is check from endpoints. Okay, meaning somehow the basic idea is I want to compare the first bit with the last bit, and then the second bit with the second from last bit, and so on and so forth. But how do I implement this on a Turing machine? Remember, Turing machine, the computation is very local. Right? It only reads where you are and then does a transition and then keeps going on. So how can I do that? So imagine I want to just, as a start, check what the first symbol is with the last symbol. How can I insert the Turing machine to do that? Any suggestions? Yeah? Okay. Right, so let's say first attempt. How can I check if x0 equals xn minus 1? Okay, so the suggestion is, you read x0 and then start moving right until you reach the end, right? But then you have to remember what you saw already too, right? Because if you forget it, then you're kind of stuck. So you have to keep kind of going to the right until you see the end of the tape. How can I recognize I've seen the end of the tape, end of the input, sorry? How can my head recognize that I've reached the end of the input? Yeah?
Head is pointing to the null line.
Right. Head is pointing to an empty symbol. Okay? So then you know that you've reached the end, and then you have to step back. Right? Because it's all local. Okay? So let me write this in more elaborate terms. So the suggestions I see so far are, let me split it into two steps. Remember what the first symbol is. Okay? And then keep scanning or keep scanning right until you reach N. Okay? So how can I remember what symbol I saw in the first bit? We have a state for it. That's really the only kind of memory we can keep for long term, right? We have this tape on which we can read and write, but every time my view is so local, I only see one symbol, right? So the way to remember what you saw in the first bit is, if I see a 0, I jump to a different state. If I see a 1, I jump to a different state. And then I keep scanning right until you reach the end. Okay? And once you reach the end, you want to check if the last symbol matches. Okay? Now, if there's a match, what should you do? Somehow you did this first thing where, I read the first symbol, I remembered it, I went to the end. We have to specify how to do that in more detail. But it at least makes sense that a local machine, a machine that operates locally, can do it. You reach the end, I check if it's the same. If they're both the same, what should I do next? Yeah?
We're going to want to check the second one, so we need to change basically delete the last one.
Okay, we can delete the last one, but then we have to come back to the first, right? But when we're scanning back, how do I know what the second symbol is? How do I remember that I'm looking only for the second symbol now instead of the starting symbol?
Starting symbol too.
When?
When you go past it, the triangle symbol.
Right, so basically the suggestion is, to match second symbol, I need to go back all the way, identify the first one again, and then move one step to the left, right? So if yes, go back to first, to second symbol. And repeat. Okay, but this seems a little like, let me make this a little easier. So what I'm going to do is, whenever I read the first symbol, remember what the first symbol is? What I'm going to do is put a mark there saying I saw the symbol already. Okay? So, and flag first symbol as red. Okay, meaning, okay, you've seen the symbol already, now you have to look for something else. So now we can rephrase our going back, right? I can rephrase it as go back to leftmost unmarked symbol. Okay. And repeat. Does this make sense? So you see a read a symbol. I read it as 0. Okay, I jump to a state, but I'm also going to mark it as red. Then scroll all the way to the right. I see, okay, it's a match. Then I come back, but I have to stop just before the last marked symbol. So jump forward and then keep repeating this back and forth. Okay. And if there is no match, what should you do? Well, if the first and last symbols don't match, then we know that the string is not a palindrome. So we should just reject flat out. We don't try to do anything else. Right? So we know what the output should be. Output 0 and halt. Okay? Make sense? Yeah?
So to output 0 and halt, we have to go all the way back to the left.
Right. So when we say output 0 and halt, that also is kind of not a single step. I can't just say machine, okay, output 0 and halt. And so wherever the head is, remember we had a very narrow definition of what the output is. It's what's on the tape until the head's position. Okay? So somehow we have to make sure that the tape now reads as we want it to. So we have to kind of go back and write 0 there and then end. Okay? So let's do this exercise once where we dig into each of these sort of high level steps to convince ourselves that this is enough for a Turing machine to actually work. Okay? And later on, we won't dig into these details, like, write down the explicit transitions, but kind of, this level of description will be enough. Yeah? Yes, yes. So keep scanning until right, until you reach end. That is true. To reach end, mark as red. Yeah, because somehow when we keep scanning right, we have to scan until kind of you reach the rightmost unread symbol. Okay? Yeah?
We need an output 1 case.
Right, so we need an output 1 case too. Okay, let's fill in the gaps for all of these things. Okay? So that's the high level idea. And so for the machine, we have several states. The alphabet of the machine is going to be simple enough. We'll have the usual things. These are the standard 4 elements that in our definition every Turing machine will have. And I'm going to add one extra alphabet symbol. Let me call it A. Just to, like, is a shorthand for this symbol has been read. Okay, it's like, okay, I've marked this as red. And in designing a Turing machine, we get to pick the alphabet as long as it's finite. Even if you're only computing the input is binary, I can add extra symbols, that's fine. Okay, as long as it's a constant number that doesn't grow with the input size, it's fine. And here we have one extra one and, like, 2 standard ones. All right. So let's think what's going to happen now. So we have x0, x1, so on. And here's where the head is. Okay. So let me write down a few of the transitions. So when I'm in state 0, okay, initially the Turing machine for us always starts in the state 0. And if I see a 0 symbol at the beginning, what should I do? I should remember that the first symbol is a 0, right? And it should also come with a specific instruction. Okay, you read 0, now you have to go to the end of the input. Okay, so I'm going to create a new state which I'll call go end 0, meaning I'm in a state where I'm going to scan to the end and try and match the ending symbol with 0. Okay, and I'm going to write down this x0 or write it as marked. I've seen the symbol, right? That's what I'm writing. And what should the head do? It should move to the right. Okay. And similarly, if I see a 1, I'll say you go to end scan 1. That's your next mode of existence. And move to the right. So these two together are implementing remember, if I can remember the spelling of remember first unread bit and mark it read. Okay. So this in English sentence translates to these two transitions on the Turing machine. Okay. And what should go end 0 do? How do I do this? How do I carry out? How do I translate the instruction? Go to the end and look for 0 as a series of transitions. What should go end 0 do on an input of 0? So see a 0, what should happen? You just move to the right. There's nothing to do, right? You don't do anything until you reach the end. So the state stays the same. You know, I don't overwrite it with anything. I just move my head. If I see a 1 also, it's the same thing. You know, you haven't seen the end of the input. So just kind of skip and move ahead. All right. So this is keep moving to find end. All right. And now if I see the end, how do I know if I see the end? You'll find the empty symbol, right? Basically, I'm here, I scan, and here I hit the empty symbol. And I have to do something. What should I do now once I see the end? Well, the next step kind of changes, right? I need to do something else now. I need to focus on trying to match. Okay? So I'm going to say, go to the state, which is check 0. Don't write anything, but move the head to the left. Okay? Meaning, I scan, I reach the end. Now I have to jump back, but I have to try and match the symbol to 0. Okay, so found end. Okay, and now what should I do if I'm in check 0 and I see a 0? Meaning you found the end and looking for a 0 in the end, and you found a 0. So what should the machine do? Well, that's like this yes case that we have, right? As you guys told me, you need to go back and find the first unmarked symbol and then repeat the whole thing. Okay? So I'm going to say go start. Go and find the first unmarked symbol. And I'm going to overwrite this as an empty thing, meaning I've seen this 0, it's been matched, and I'll move the head to the left. Found match, go to start, and find, I should say, find first unmarked symbol. Okay? It's a little bit tedious to write down this code, but we'll do it once, as I said, and later on, these high-level explanations will suffice. Right? And you can keep on going. Now I have to tell you how to write this go start. Right? How do you implement this go start? How can I find the first unmarked symbol on the tape? Well, I'll just say it in verse. You keep moving to the left until you see A. Once you see the A, you know that you reached the first unmarked symbol. You jump to the right. Okay? And if I see a 1 here while I'm searching for a 0, what does that mean? That means the input should be rejected because you found a mismatch. How do I reject? How do I write down the input? Well, I'll say enter a state whose sole purpose is to kind of clean up the tape, and it's write 0. Okay? So clean up tape and write 0. Okay? So if I keep on going like this, there are lots of instructions that I have to write. Basically, go start, well, how do I implement that? If I see a 0, I move to the left. If I see a 1, I move to the left. If I see a mark symbol, that's when I know that I found a mark symbol and I move to the right. Okay? And all those things like that. Any questions about how to carry out these instructions? Yeah?
Write 0 to write 0.
So here we found a mismatch. So the function should output 0. Right? So that means I'm just telling my Turing machine to enter the state where I found the output, but you have to clean up the tape and write 0 on the tape. Oh, it's writing a 1 just where you are. Basically, its meaning is not writing anything, right? It's just keeping it, but it's transitioning the state to enter something where write 0. Remember, this mismatch can happen somewhere here. Okay, so here writing 0 or 1 won't help. I need to return all the way and write the first symbol as a 0 and then halt. Okay, so there's a remarkable amount of power you can get out of these small instructions. At the same time, it seems extremely tedious to do these things which we take for granted, right? Just scan to the end of the input. It's one line. But when you try to write it in a Turing machine, it's like this whole bunch of instructions, right? And how do I implement go start? Go start for us means you have to keep going to the left until you find the last unmarked symbol, right? So let's do this one last thing, and then we will not do the more tedious thing. So go start. Find first unmarked position on input. Okay, so go start means that somehow you made progress. I found this to be a 0, which is a match. Now I have to go to the left until I see an unmarked symbol. Can one of you tell me what transitions that I should decide for that? Hold on, let me fill this out. If I see a 0, what should go start do? Meaning, I'm trying to find the first symbol that has been unmarked. But if I see a 0, what's the local instruction that I should do? Yeah? Exactly, right? So you basically stay in the same state, you don't write anything, but you move to the left. And for 1, the same, right? But if I see a, what does that mean? What should I do when I see a? Exactly. So if I see an A, that means that we jump 1 step. I mean, basically we found the first input, right? So we'll say, go to the starting state where your entire computation is started. You have to repeat the whole thing again. And you don't do anything and then move the head to the right. Okay? I think there was a question in the chat. According to the pseudocode. Yeah, so basically we're implementing the same thing that we wrote in pseudocode in actual Turing machine code. All right? And there are lots of details that you have to write. For instance, what does it mean by cleanup? What do I mean by cleanup? Cleanup means you have to write, keep going left until you see start, you write 1. Or keep going left until you see start and write 0 and halt. Okay? So we also have to do cleanup and output. So those can be specified as another code block. Okay? The good thing here is that you can kind of break up the instructions into small sets, at least, which will help you understand that. And at the end of the day, if you do all of these things, you can find a Turing machine for palindrome with alphabet, which is basically 0, 1, A, and number of states is 10. Okay? So there is a way to do this. Hold on. There are questions in here. Okay. Where should we write A instead of the null symbol when we reach the end according to the pseudocode? Yeah, so that's a good question. We can either write A or I shouldn't say the null symbol, you should say the empty symbol. You could do either. I just decided to write empty because it reduces the number of instructions a little bit. You can also write A and change it. And why are we using 2 separate symbols, A and C, to indicate the input we are looking at as ended? Why can't we use 1? So we can definitely use 1. Here, it just simplifies the number of instructions you have to write, and both are equivalent. Okay? And what I'm describing here is not the most optimal Turing machine, in the sense that you can reduce the number of instructions, number of states if you want to, but I think that makes it less clear and more tedious. Okay, and we saw a simulation of this in last lecture, but we can check it. Okay, so these here, like I've written all of the instructions down, right? So when I see a 0, you go to the end and find this 0, right? But you write A. Okay, and in the simulator, the greater than symbol means you move to the right. Go end 1, same. Matching is 0 at end. So go to the last unmatched symbol. It's the same instructions that we had. And the empty state is denoted with an underscore. And when you see it, you enter check 0. Okay? And you found a match, rewrite symbol. We now need to go to the first unmatched. So you can keep going, basically. It takes 100 lines, which I'm not going to do in class. But let's just do okay. Let me make it even simpler. Okay, so this is the input. The starting state is Q0. 1, I need to enter go end 1. Okay, so it's going to start looking for the end of the input. End of the input. I found the end of the input. Now come back and check for 1. It didn't find a 1, right? So that means it found a mismatch. So what should it do? I mean, I wrote it as Q reject because, I mean, I should have said Q write 1. Okay. And then you keep going to the left, clean up the tape, find the start of the tape, which is a triangle symbol, and then you write 0 and stop. Okay. That's it. And you can make it more messy. It found the end. It comes back, checks for 1, finds a 1, so it's going to go to start now. Finds an A, move ahead, and now we're exactly in the starting position, right? I cut off the first one and the end one, and now I have to check whatever string is left is itself a palindrome. Okay, so you're going to do the exact same computation, starting with the state 0. Now I see 0, so I end up in go end 0, go to the end, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you have to be a little bit careful about the end case, but again, that's some minor details which you can fill in as needed. Right? But the nitty-gritty details of how we write these instructions are not really as important as this conceptual thing that what we got in the pseudocode, that you can break up the seemingly complicated stuff into a sequence of local instructions. Go start is implementable just by looking at locally what you're doing. Okay? Any questions about this? All right. Okay, so this is one example. Let's do one more example, and this time I'll stop just with the pseudocode. Okay? But the pseudocode should be at a level where you can appreciate, I mean, you can understand that these steps can be implemented by local updates. Okay, you can't write down Python code and say, okay, that's my pseudocode for Turing machine. That's a bit too high level. At the same time, you should not always have to go deep and write down the machine level instructions, the transition functions. Okay, you have to find the right middle ground. Let's do one more example. And the example I have in mind is L, which is all strings X, okay, which are in 0, 1 star. Number of ones is greater than or equal to number of zeros, okay, which is, well, actually, let me call it majority. Okay, so my language is all those strings where the number of ones in the string is more than or equal to the number of zeros in the string. So something like 100 is not in the language, 110 is in the language, 10 is in the language, and so on. All right. So how can I write down a Turing machine for majority? We already saw that this is not computable by regular by DFAs. This is not a regular language. We prove it using the pumping lemma. Okay, but why or how can a Turing machine do it? Let's again think of something which is at the level of English sentences, right? We don't have to write down the transitions. By the level of English sentences, I really mean, like, you can use things like go to the start, go to the end. Okay. Any suggestions on how I can use such things? Use a Turing machine to recognize whether the number of ones is greater than or equal to number of zeros. If I ask you to write a Python program, what would you do? You just count, right? You just count the number of ones. But counting actually is a bit harder than this problem. Counting with a Turing machine can be done, It's a little bit more complicated. Here, there is actually a simpler way to do it. Any suggestions? Yeah? Exactly. So the idea is somehow the fact that you're looking for more ones than zeros, that means, okay, you can try and match zeros and ones, right? For every one, I try to find a zero. If I find a zero, I kind of mark up them both, right? And if they're not the same, then you output, the answer is kind of known at that point. This is like how, maybe my 4-year-old daughter would try and compare things, right? If I give her 4 candy and I take something, then she'll really move things around to check which is higher, right? So that's exactly what the Turing machine is going to do. So I scan to write. Let me change your idea a little bit because that's how I implemented it in the simulator. So instead of scanning for a 1, I'm going to first scan for a 0. So scan to right until you find a 0. Okay? So I found a 0. Well, if there are no zeros in the input, what can you do? Well, if there is no zeros in the input, then the answer should be 1, right? Because there are no zeros in the input, so that means there are more ones. So you say clean up and return 1. Okay? And this is always kind of, this step clean up and return 1 is kind of always the same, right? You keep going to the left until you start, then you write down 1 and halt. Okay? If you found a 0, what should you do? Well, as suggested, if I found a 0, then I have to look for 1 in my input, right? Because if I don't find a matching 1, that means there are more zeros than ones. So we say mark the 0 as seen. Now go to start of the input, scan input to find a 1. Okay. So wherever I found a 0, I need to find one unmatched 1 in my input. And it could be to the front or to the right, so I go to the start and then start looking for a 1. Okay. So if 1 found, then what should I do? Well, I found 1 and there is a matching 0, so I mark both of them as seen, and that's it. 1 found, mark it as seen, go to start. Okay? And if 1 not found, meaning there are more zeros than ones. I found a 0, but I cannot find any more ones in my input. You clean up and return 0. Okay? So question, what about no zeros and no ones? Well, you can decide the function is going to output 1 in that case. Okay? And in general, I'd say, especially for Turing machines, don't worry so much about the border cases. You can always fix them by hard coding them if you needed to. But the main thing is you need to get the bigger sort of algorithm right. Yeah? So cleanup is basically like our shorthand for saying you go to the start and write down 0 and halt. Okay? Because remember that the Turing machine outputs everything on the machine until where the head is. So you can think of cleanup as, okay, I'm going to stop the head in the first position, and that's going to be it. Or as in the simulation, what I've done is, kind of erase the tape as well to make it more clear as to what's happening. But it's not really, needed as per the instructions. Okay? Yeah?
Is the output like up to the head or?
Including the head. Okay? So that's it. So this is our algorithm, right? And the good thing is, like, somehow this level of detail is enough. But at the same time, to write Turing machines, you need to think in a very different local way. Okay. So let's do a demo of this too. Called it minority of zeros. Well, we can just run it on this input. So the starting state is you are looking for a 0. Okay, and I found a 0, so I go to the start and look for a 1. Means I first need to find the start. I found the start, now find a 1 in my input. I found a 1 already, so I'm basically done. And now I try to find a 0. Found a 0, so I need to go to the start of the input. I found a 1. Now I go to the start again. And I say you found the start of the input, find a 0. Okay, so I didn't find any 0. So I say, okay, clean up the tape and output 1. All right. Let's just do one more. Let's say 0, 0. What happens? The distance might seem very limited, right? But you can really, what if I'm not interested in just whether number of ones is exactly equal to number of zeros? What if I'm interested in a different proportion? All of those can be implemented by similar local instructions. Okay? And in the homework, just a second, there are a couple of questions for which you might need to use these routines. Okay, and all of you have access to them, so look at them. Okay, the question, yeah. Not necessarily, right? Because maybe the input said 0, 0, 1. So I find a 0, there's an 8 there, then I start looking for 1, maybe 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0. Okay. Then the first A I could find might be in the middle of the input, might be a 1, but there could still be a 0 before. Right, so you might as well just go all the way back. Okay. Good question. Yeah, in many cases, I'm not optimizing the level of the number of states or something. In fact, people really care about those things, but we are not really being very stringent about them. Okay. All right. Let's take a 5-minute break, but when we come back, we'll move away from this sort of very precise implementations and talk about the bigger picture of what Turing machines are. Okay. All right. So let me take a few minutes to, just, say a little bit of history, right? This is Alan Turing, who is really the founding father of modern computing. His paper from 1936, which defines Turing machines. It's not only just defined Turing machines. As we'll see, it also showed 2 really remarkable results within mathematics and theoretical computer science as we know it today. Kind of his paper also laid a blueprint for what general purpose computers are, how you can build compilers for languages within themselves, and all kinds of stuff like that. And he was also, a long distance runner. He was also responsible for breaking the Enigma machine that during World War II played a very important role in cryptanalysis, where he kind of did something very much like, instead of using manual skill to break a code, sort of design a machine which can break the code for you, right? If you have seen this movie, if you haven't seen this movie, it's okay. It's not that great. But the book is really good. And another really interesting thing is where the script analysis, where Turing did do a lot of work, also had some interesting history because the word computer came about in this setting where people used to perform calculations, right? And these calculations and everything were critical in many important achievements during the war, during the space missions, and so on, right? And most of these human computers, as they were called at the time, were women. You can see the computing division, and it's all people really doing the calculations. If you haven't seen the movie Hidden Figures, that I would highly recommend. It's really good. It's about these people who were really the first computers. And finally, there are tons of jokes you can find on Turing machines. One of my favorites is this one, where you might develop a tendency of behaving like Turing machines by the end of the course. Hopefully, that will be my biggest achievement. Okay, candy button paper. All right, let's get back to more serious stuff. Should also say Turing's story, as amazing he was, it's also kind of tragic. He was harassed repeatedly by the British government, and he committed suicide in the end at the age of 52. Yeah, but he's a real icon. Okay, so what did we do so far? Right, so we defined a new model of computing, right? So we defined a new model by essentially adding two things to our DFAs. We called it Turing machines, basically after Turing, who invented them. And we also already saw that Turing machines are more powerful than DFAs. They are more powerful than DFAs. They can compute non-regular languages. And obviously, any DFA is also basically a Turing machine, right? You just don't have to remember anything, and everything kind of goes through. All right? So when we talked about DFAs, we said a function is regular or a language is regular if it is computable by a DFA, if there is a DFA to recognize it. But here we are really going to take things to the extreme in a seemingly unreasonably arrogant way. And if there is for a language or a function, if there is a Turing machine that can compute it, we'll call it just computable. Okay? So a function f is computable if there exists a Turing machine that computes f. Okay? So why do I say it's kind of, seemingly arrogant definition, right? Because it's kind of, we're saying anything is computable if a Turing machine computes it. But at this point, it seems unreasonable, right? You just add two things to a DFA. Maybe, there are things that a Turing machine cannot compute. Maybe there's a Turing machine version of the pumping lemma which says that, okay, here's a simple thing that you can program on your computer, but a Turing machine cannot compute it. Right? What prevents that from happening? And as it turns out, we can also say that Turing machines is essentially a programming language. Right? You can give a sequence of instructions, define some variables, and in the end, it puts out an output. Right? So it is like a programming language, but it seems extremely limited, right? So what are some programming constructs or things that you use in your favorite algorithmic problems or OS design assignments which you'd like to see in a Turing machine? Tell me, give me some examples. What are some things that if I ask you to go and write programming in Turing machines, that you'd really, really miss compared to Python or any other language? Too many options? Just start with a few. NumPy, okay. All right, so we have Turing machines here. And things like NumPy would be missing. But NumPy is really a library, right? It's actually missing something even more basic, which is Turing machines don't have indexable arrays. Right? If I basically tell you that you can have an array as you want, but you can only scan the array from left to right or right to left, you can't just randomly index in this position. That would be so tedious, right? So these are called random access machines, not the album, but actual machines. Okay? Or RAMs. We talked about 16 GB RAM and so on. They're really about random access memory and things like that. And what else? Right? You can think of all the high-level languages that we have. We have Java, we have C, we have Python, you have Lisp. All of those things, all of these languages have their own unique power. Like Java has classes, which are very powerful. C doesn't have them. Python has everything. Lisp has currying, right? Compared to all of these, Turing machine seems like a wimp, right? It doesn't have anything. It can only go left and right and so on. But here's a really surprising claim. Turing machines can implement random access. Okay, I can sort of write a sub-machine or sub-code which essentially gives Turing machines the power to do random access. Okay, once I have this, I can do data structures, I can do hash maps, I can do dictionaries, I can do fast lookup, all of those things. And the theorem that we won't prove in this class, but you can find a proof in the textbook, is the following. Which kind of gives evidence of this definition, not being just out of hubris by Turing. So this is something we're not going to give a proof of. For every Python program you can think of, okay, there exists a Turing machine M such that P of x equals M of x for all inputs. Okay. No matter how complicated a Python program is, I can write down a Turing machine which has the exact same behavior. You might wonder how you could prove such a thing. Well, the way to prove it is in some sense how you write a compiler or an interpreter for Python, right? So you show that it suffices to do some basic instructions to simulate any Python program, and then you show that a Turing machine can simulate those basic instructions, and then that's it. Okay, and not just that. Actually, remarkably, if the Python program, takes this time. A time is like steps. The number of steps you perform in the Python program is t, right? Then m only takes t squared time. Okay. Not only is it true that Turing machines can simulate any Python program, but they can also do it just at a quadratic blowup. I mean, in practice, a quadratic blowup is a huge deal, right? But this is like 100-year-old model, almost. Okay. So in some sense, the simulation that we saw for palindrome, that was like taking quadratic time. And we're saying it's not just for palindromes. We can do this pretty much for any complicated function, any complicated program you have. Okay? And this is something that we're not going to show. All right? But let's kind of, hint at some of the things that might go to it. Okay, at least it seems that Turing machines are just as powerful as anything that you can actually run on a computer, right? But what if I want to, kind of build a more powerful version of Turing machine? What can I add some more power to it? What are some ways where you can enhance Turing machine? If I ask you, okay, you are going to be the modern Turing, just build on top of him, top of the model that he introduced, add something so that you get more out of it. What would be some things that you might try? Any suggestions? It's all right if they don't work. What are some things? One thing you can say is, okay, can we go beyond Turing machines? What are some things you can try? Well, even if you think of today's computers, right? There is, you can have multiple processors, right? You can have not just a single core, you can have multiple cores and stuff like that. Okay, so what's an equivalent of that in the Turing machine world? Multiple tapes. So what if I, allow multiple tapes for a Turing machine? Okay. So what if someone comes and says, oh, okay, so Turing came up with this model in 1936, but I'm going to dramatically increase the power by saying, instead of just allowing one tape, you are now allowed to use, let's say, 3 tapes, 5 tapes, 10 tapes, whatever. Okay. So meaning, instead of just having a single memory, right? I actually have multiple tapes with different kind of controls and transition functions. Okay? Multiple heads on the, oh yeah, that's another suggestion, multiple heads on the same tape. Right? Why have only one head? Now maybe my function My transitions could depend not just on a single bit on the tape, but maybe 10 tapes, 10 positions on the tape. I could have multiple heads on the same tape. Or maybe multiple everything. Multiple tapes, multiple heads. Okay, why not, right? So just for being formal, let me describe what having multiple tapes per Turing machine would mean. So let's just check our skills with formally defining stuff. Okay, you have a definition of a Turing machine, which is very formal. You had to have this transition function and things like that. Now you are going to write the next extension of Turing Machine 2.0. It's multiple tapes. What should the formal definition be? Any guesses? Like, what do I need to define these things formally? Just suppose we have, maybe L tapes. Well, I have to define a transition function, right? So for a single tape, there was a transition function which specified the Turing machine fully. For multiple tapes, also is the same thing. I need to tell you what the transition function should do. But what are the ingredients in the transition function? What should the input and output of the transition function be? Any guesses? Well, the transition function now, since there are multiple tapes, there are 3 heads, there are possibly 3 different states that each of those Turing machines are running on. Okay, so my machine could be something like k to the L times sigma to the L, and then outputs a state for each of those, a symbol to write on each of them, and then how each head moves separately. Okay, it's just like you have way more options. I have to tell you what happens when my head is reading some symbol here, some symbol here, some symbol here, and what state I am in here, what state I'm in here, what state I'm in here, and then I have to tell you what each of those heads does. Okay, right? So now everything else is the same. Okay, so meaning once I define my multiple head, multiple tape Turing machine, this transition function, I set up the input so that on the first tape, maybe you start with x0 through xn minus 1, and then the output is whatever is on the first tape, and so on. Okay, and this does seem very powerful, right? In fact, if you think of the palindrome examples, it is possible to implement palindrome using 2 tapes in linear time, as opposed to quadratic time with a single tape. Okay, so let's see an illustration of that. So just as a idea, if I allow you to use 2 tapes, how might you think of solving the palindromes thing faster? Yeah? Right, so if I ask you to if I allow you the use of 2 tapes, then it's kind of easier to solve a palindrome, right? Because I don't have to do this back and forth. So one simple thing I can do is maybe I just copy the string on the second tape in reverse, or just copy it as it is, but move the second head all the way to the end and always keep moving like this. Okay, so that's exactly what this implementation does. So it's trying to copy the symbols exactly, and then it moves one head to the start. And now it starts comparing them. Okay, much faster. What happens if I do 0? So I copy the input onto the second tape, leave the first head towards the end, move the second head to the start, and then start comparing. I found a mismatch, so it just stopped. Okay, right? Okay. So it does seem like it's buying you something, but remarkably, again, multi-tape Turing machines are no more powerful than single-tape Turing machines. Okay, and just as you could implement any Python program, multiple tape Turing machines can be simulated by a single tape Turing machine. Okay, and you'll explore this in the homework. Okay, and in fact, just as it was true for Python programs, you can simulate any multiple tape Turing machine as a single tape Turing machine with at most a quadratic blow-up. All right. So now we are ready to state one of the fundamental laws of nature, which is the real Church-Turing thesis. So Alonzo Church was Turing's PhD advisor at Princeton, where kind of this thesis has its origins. And what does it say? It says that Turing machines are the only model of computation that you need to worry about. Okay, so every function that is computable. Well, if I say every function that is computable by Turing machine, that's a meaningless tautology at this point, because we define computability as that. But really what this said, by physical means, is computable by a Turing machine. Okay, and this is again something like a law of nature. You're not going to be able to prove it. Okay, just as an apple will fall down everywhere, anything that is computable by any physical means is actually computable by a Turing machine. Okay, that's the law, and let me say this is a law of nature. Okay, and remarkably, there is really no challenge here. Even you might think, okay, how about quantum computers, right? But even quantum computers are simulatable by a Turing machine. Okay, even quantum computers, there is a Turing machine which can simulate them exactly, right? There will be some difference in the number of steps performed, potentially. But at the end of the day, whether or not the problem is solvable by computational means in whatever notion is essentially boils down just to Turing machines. The question, what about randomness? Again, an excellent question. Anything that is solvable by randomized algorithms is doable by a Turing machine. You can prove that. Quantum computing also you can prove that anything that is computable by quantum algorithms is also computable by a Turing machine. So for most models of computation that you can think of, you can actually show that they are implementable just within a Turing machine. Okay, but that doesn't mean that you can prove this thesis, because tomorrow someone might come and say, what if I use some black holes to do some computing somewhere? Well, we believe that that should still be simulatable by a Turing machine. If not, that's like a new sort of experiment that we need to figure out. Okay? So it's remarkable that now we have a model which we think is going to withstand the test of time no matter how many years you go on. All right? Let's try and see what implications this might have for us. Okay, we have this great universal sort of looking model of computation which we think is the end goal. Once we have this, it allows us unique power to reason about what things are actually solvable by computers. And the book has a funny way of phrasing this, which I like. So let me call it. So it calls it the, I don't think Boaz is very good with acronyms, but this is, he calls it the HOCAEIP principle. Do you know what this is? No? Have your cake and eat it too. Okay? So the have your cake part of it is that to show something is computable. Again, don't think about the specific constraints of this class, but you just go out in the wild and someone says, oh, I really want to know whether this function can eventually be done on a computer. Okay? Someone comes and says, I really have to solve this problem. I have to detect if there's some anomaly in this data or something like that. Is this solvable? Well, if I had to answer this question, I really have to implement a Turing machine and show that we can do it on a Turing machine, right? But that's just like, we don't have to do it again and again. We did it once. If we have this theorem that any program can be simulated by a Turing machine, then we just have to come up with a program from then on, right? That's the have your cake principle. So to show something is computable, you can use a high-level programming language. Okay? If I ask you to show that something is solvable on a computer, is computable, you can use your favorite programming language to do it. Okay? Don't do it on the exam when I ask you to build a Turing machine. But basically, in principle, in the big picture, this is true. Because we show that anything computable, any Python program, for instance, because we claim that any of those things are implemented by Turing machine, it just suffices to show how you can use a high-level programming language to do it. This is the have your cake part, meaning you can kind of obscure, kind of hide the annoying, tedious nature of the definition of Turing machines when you want to just find an algorithm. But what's the advantage? Well, the flip side is the eat it too part. Okay. Now suppose that you really believe this task cannot be done by any computer. Okay. Something is impossible to solve on a computer. How can you do that? To show something is uncomputable. Something cannot be solved no matter what programming language you use, no matter what hardware you use. They have to show something like that. It suffices to just show that there is no Turing machine which can do it. Just show, that Turing machines cannot do it. Okay. So in some sense, if you want to come up with an upper bound saying that, okay, I can solve this problem on the computer, I can use all the power, Python, hash dictionary, hash maps, dictionaries, random indexing and everything, right? But if you want to show an impossibility result, it's much harder to show the impossibility result for all these additional features you can imagine, right? But we know because of Church-Turing thesis that it suffices to just show that a Turing machine cannot do it. Okay? Any questions about this? All right. So, I mean, this is all again at a very high level, right? But we're talking about these things. And this is one of the main implications of the definition of Turing machines. We now have this universal model. But then Turing not only defined this and introduced this thesis, but in his paper, he talked about two other things which we'll cover in the rest of this, we'll keep revisiting in the rest of this class, right? And the first is okay. So let me say theorem 1, which we'll prove in the next class that in his 1936 paper, Turing did two other things. One is that, well, we saw the Turing machines that we think of as the ultimate model of computation, and we went one step further. What would be one step further? Well, we showed that there actually is a single Turing machine that can simulate all Turing machines. Okay, so he called this universal Turing machine. Okay. There's a single Turing machine that can simulate all Turing machines. And there's a question in the chat which is, could you give an example of something that is not computable? Well, it's actually hard to come up with this example, and that again goes back to the genius of Turing, who in the same paper showed that there are functions that are uncomputable. Okay. Philosophically, this is very deep. It's saying, okay, here's a task that nobody or there's no machine can solve. Okay. And it's not easy to come up with these examples. In the original paper, Turing had a kind of more complicated thing that we'll look at. But in the end, we'll see there are many tasks that we face with in day-to-day life, which we wish we could solve, but they turn out to be uncomputable. Okay? And we'll look at those examples in 2 or 3 lectures from now. And some very important computational tasks, unfortunately, are unsolvable. Okay? And so let me say first a little bit about this universal Turing machine. This is highly circular logic in the sense that we are saying not only a Turing machine is universal as a model of computation, there is a single one which can simulate all of them. It's a little bit like what we did for Boolean circuits, right? We defined this notion of universal circuits, right? Where once I lay down the wires for this one circuit, it can simulate all of the circuits based on manipulating the input. Okay? But there's one difference for Turing machines which makes it even more extreme, which is recall universal Boolean circuits, right? So we define this notion of circuits, which runs are laid on the wires. You can simulate all of the circuits, but there was a difference, which is that the circuit, the universal Boolean circuit, could only simulate circuits of size smaller than it, right? Only simulates circuits of smaller size. Okay, but Turing's universality result is really, really mind-bending because a single Turing machine, there are a lot of competitions on how many states, how many instructions, how many alphabet you can have. So for instance, you can say tens, maybe let's say, to be conservative, say 50 states, 10 symbols in alphabet can simulate all Turing machines, no matter the size of the Turing machine. Okay, there's a single 10-state Turing machine which can simulate even 1 million state Turing machines or 1 billion state Turing machines. That's also possible. Okay, it's a little bit like how your compilers work, right? I have a compiler which is some number of lines of code, but it can run any program which is probably much bigger than the compiler itself. Okay, does this make an intuitive sense? We'll talk about formally. So the reason I'm kind of mentioning these things up front is there are two aspects to it. One are sort of the conceptual implications of the statements. One is like, as I said, there's a fixed Turing machine with like 10 states and maybe 100 symbols in its alphabet, which can simulate any other Turing machine, no matter how big it is. Okay. The other thing, this notion of uncomputability. There are deep philosophical implications of that. You can dig into them. You can enter into arguments about them. And then there's the actual technical stuff that goes into proving these things. Okay. And both of these, once again, come up from stuff that we saw for Boolean circuits. Kind of there is a parallel between the two. So the way we'll approach them, and we'll do this on Wednesday really, is first show you programs or Turing machines as input. Okay. So this view that I can view programs or now Turing machines as input is going to be central to both of these theorems. Okay. So like we saw that we can encode a circuit as a string, and which allowed us to do two remarkable things. One was the notion of universality, one was to show a lower bound. Kind of a strong parallel here. We'll write programs of Turing machines as input, and that will lead us to general purpose computers or universal Turing machines. The other is uncomputable functions. Two seemingly completely unrelated things. Both of them kind of start from viewing programs as input. And they are kind of confusing, so be prepared. And confusing in the sense that you have to bend over backwards to avoid taking things literally. Okay, so you'll end up eating your own tail if you start taking things literally. But we'll see how to do two of those things. And just as a kind of, amazing thing, here's the universal Turing machine from Turing's paper. Right, he actually coded up this Turing machine, displayed all the transitions, all the symbols, and he said, this is the universal Turing machine. And he also understood the importance of it. Okay, which is kind of what we as computer scientists do, right? We build a tool that others can use to solve their own problems. We always do meta things. We build an algorithm which solves an infinitude of problems, right? In the same way, a universal Turing machine is something like that, okay? And this is a literal quote from Turing's paper. And just as a coincidence, this is the week that actually the paper came out, November 12th, 1936. This is November 8th. If 12th was actually a Monday, I would have timed everything to do it on that day, but that wasn't possible this year. Last year it was, so I could do it.